This week's Eldritch Lorecast, we give a sneak peek into Fables 2, Pirates of the Etherial Expanse, and we discuss what you need to do to publish your D&D campaign setting. All that and more right now. Cool, all right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the #1 D&D podcast in all the multiverse. That's right, the Sphinxes tried to alter time last week to get more Eldritch Lorecast. They did not succeed, but this week we're back with another episode. My name is Ben Byrne, and I am here, as always, with Dael Kingsmill, James Hake, Shawn Merwin. Shawn, I gotta ask, is time relative? What do you think?
You talk about the spice. You can't use too much of it, or it will really throw off the recipe.
Yeah, fair enough. I appreciate that. James, time, is it relevant, or do you think it moves faster or slower?
Is it relevant?
Is that what it... Relative, that's what I mean to say.
It's certainly relevant when I'm staring down the barrel of a deadline. Is it relative? Yes. I know at least two wizards who can cast Time Stop with their 9th level spell slot, which makes it very, very relative indeed.
That is true. I have never quite gotten that far, as we've established. All my players stay on level 2 the whole time. But I fear the day I face a time stop. Dael Kingsmill, is time relevant? Is time relevant and or relative?
I think it's both relevant and relative. I feel like I'm enamored with that whole thing of like the closer you get to light speed, the time gets warped. You know, the Year of 89 by Queen.
Sure.
Or that movie with Matthew McConaughey.
I feel that way about, like, even just people being on other parts of the globe, how we have time zones and things. It's like, you know, it feels like there's a time dilation thing happening between. I'm like, what is this person on the other side of the world literally doing this second? Probably sleeping, chances are. And
I mean, it's like, I'm sure that time to some extent is a construct that is just, how we measure the movement of objects through space, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a very real impact on our lives. So it is relevant.
There we go. We've solved it. We've solved the time problem. No more time dilation issues. Speaking of wibbly wobbly, timey wimey, ethereal stuff. Things. Bit of Ghostfire news this week. The teaser was dropped in the Discord. I don't know if it's been dropped publicly yet, but if you haven't seen it, go join the Ghostfire Gaming Discord. There'll be a link in the show notes. For Fables 2, that's right, Fables 1, Citadel of the Unseen Sun is coming to a close this month, and next month commences with Fables 2, Pirates of the Etherial Expanse. This is quite a change of pace. James, what can you tell us?
Oh my goodness. I'm so excited that that Pirates is kind of beginning to come out in the open, because I've been working on it for months and months and months and months now. We have a full trailer coming in the near future, so that teaser was really just to whet your appetite. We have the incredible vocal stylings and, in fact, instrumental stylings as well of Cole McGuinness, whose music you may have heard on Critical Role. The Welcome to Wildmount song that played for all of Campaign 2 is his work. He's a fantastic musician. He's got a great voice. He fits the piratical bard tone that you're going to be hearing in the full trailer. Pirates of the Etherial Expanse, without saying too much, is a story of pirates and empires set on a segment of the astral plane known as the Etherial Expanse, where a silvery starlight substance called ether moves like water, and islands, comet-like islands, have lodged themselves in this star stuff. Through it, you'll go through a great number of Age of Sail, big four-masted galleon, cannons blazing, pirate adventures with the magic turned up to 11, as all great fantastical pirate settings should. And just like the previous Fable, it takes place over the course of 6 monthly episodes, with one notable change, because unlike Grim Hollow, which Citadel of the Unseen Sun took place in, this Ethereal Expanse has no setting guide to ground your adventures in it. The first episode of this fable will be a little shorter, but it will you will be more than well satisfied for your page count needs by a massive setting guide and new mechanics guide that will accompany your introduction to the Ethereal Expanse.
And speaking of the new mechanics guide, I know because I playtested a little bit of the ship-to-ship combat. What can you tell us? What tidbits can you sprinkle in about that?
It is an incredibly in-depth ship combat system. And it's so in-depth, we included a very rules-light version of it as well. So if you want your piracy to be more of a sort of story element, you have a very sort of streamlined, pared-down version. But if you are in for the in-depth, tactical, ship-to-ship, broadside action, there's a full, it's almost like a mini-game, a game within a game of how you and your crew that you've hired aboard your ship can work together to take down and plunder enemy ships. Incredibly in-depth. It's by a wonderful designer by the name of Sam Mannel, who you may have encountered in MCDM's Arcadia, doing a very good aerial combat rules module called Aces High.
Is it kind of, I legitimately don't know the answer to this, so I hope I don't catch you out, but is there a sort of, speaking of Mass Effect from before we were recording, vibe to it where the party kind of have their Normandy somewhere in the adventure and then it's theirs to command and go talk to all the NPCs?
Well, there is a ship that you'll gain, but just like in sort of real world piracy, it's expected that you'll probably hop ship a number of times. In real life, pirates in the Age of Sail would often try to solve an engagement by doing as little damage to their ship as possible, using their own reputation, intimidation tactics to get their foes to surrender before a single shot was fired. And then they would just take their ship. They throw everyone in the brig or, sabotage their own ship. Someone take all the valuables off, put the other crew onto the other ship and say, good luck. We'll be taking your ship and all your stuff. And then, the real life Blackbeard, for existence, didn't get to his famous ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, just, out of the blue. He worked his way up through a series of stepping stones to get to a gigantic, powerful, feared ship. But he kept his flag all along the way. Pirate crews may change ship, but they keep their flag as a symbol of their reputation and fearsome deeds all across the sea.
Gotcha.
And all that historical knowledge has been kind of pulled into the mechanics for this ship. Ethereal Expanse it's not a dark fantasy setting in the way that Grim Hollow is. It's a very sort of swashbuckling and high magic and explosive and big sort of thing. But I really intended to give it some historical grounding by pulling in things like how did actual pirates function, to kind of counterbalance the sort of wild and whimsical notions of piracy that we've gained through our popular media.
Well, with that sneak peek, Fables Pirates of the Ethereal Expanse coming on July 1st. Check it out at the ghostfiregaming.com where you can sign up for Fables and get the monthly releases. A bit of a change of pace, but I really like it. I'm excited for it. And the ship combat was fun when we got to play test it. Speaking of multiverses, and questions that I legitimately don't know the answer to. Mordenkainen presents Monsters of the Multiverse. We sort of touched on it a little bit last week, more from a digital ownership standpoint. But this week, now that it's out, I wanted to talk about the book itself a little bit more. I actually haven't had it in my hands. I haven't looked through it to really delve into the details of it. But Shawn, you showed that you had a copy last week. What do you think? Because I have been hearing mixed opinions.
Mixed opinions on the internet? I don't believe it. So my understanding is that this does it. The goal of it was multifold. One goal was to put all of the player races in one book, which it has done, and make whatever tweaks necessary there were to get these races into a format and a lore position that Wizards of the Coast was trying to represent themselves with. So one of the things that they did was remove the ability modifiers tied to races, and you can put any ability modifier you want onto your character. I would say overall that is a good move, and most people, unless they're tied to lore in a grognard sort of way, would be happy with that.
Hot take.
I don't think there are any new. Yes, I don't think there are any. Oh, my filter is gone today. There are not any new monsters that I'm aware of in the book. But what they've done is similar to the races. They have tried to fix a few things with monsters. Some of it lore based, some of it ease of use. So a lot of the spell casting has been pared down. Some of it just removing spells that probably wouldn't be used as much in an encounter. Some of it moving a spell to put it as a regular action and then try to mimic the spell that was removed. So, a fireball would instead be called explosive boomingness, and it would be essentially the same thing as a fireball, but it would just be an action to cast. As far as what do I think of it, I think it's fine. I am not enthusiastic about it per se, but I am not upset about it either. Sure. I'm glad to have everything in one place now. I'm cool with the changes that I saw. It was a noble effort, I think, to try to make monsters easier to run, especially for new people coming into the game. And for new people coming into the game, it's very nice to have all the races in one place that you can play.
Do the races include, when you say all of them, I know that they've kind of pulled from all the different source books that they've done right up to the more recent ones. Like there's the Wild Beyond the Witchlight races in there, to my understanding. But do they have the Player's Handbook races, or they've kind of left them where they are?
I believe they are in there. I didn't check specifically for those, but
I did, and I don't think they are. Me. Let me double check. Let me prove myself right or wrong right now. But I believe, I don't think they've got the Player's Handbook races in.
I didn't say, like, all I've seen is
that would track to me, right? They're not putting the entire monster manual in that book, so they, the core books stand on their own.
Yeah.
Even if they're otherwise compiling all the other sort of ancillary material into that one book.
Oh, but this is a good point. Shawn's flipping through the physical copy, which I don't have. I've only looked at the digital copy. So if there is a difference, I am interested to know.
There is not. The races are not.
Not a huge point of contention. I was curious to know, all the things that they've added, the things that they didn't, throw in there.
And it is an interesting thing, right? Because if there is this kind of dual goal that Shawn is talking about, there's the ease of use, put them all in the one place, but you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to stuff it full of everything and make it hard to navigate. But there was the secondary goal of like, okay, we've had some criticism in terms of how we've handled races and how we've depicted them and essentialized certain elements as if they're baked into the DNA of a race when they maybe shouldn't be. It is interesting that with that as a secondary goal, we're still left to keep like the Player's Handbook version of half-orcs, for example, which codifies them as necessarily being savage and brutal. It's literally written into the player's race for half-orcs. So it is interesting as a choice in that aspect.
Perhaps until 2024.
True.
Yeah.
I'm kind of like Shawn. I'm not like enthusiastic about it, but I'm not deeply offended by it. I think they've taken several steps in the right direction with things. But I don't know. I feel like when it comes to this stuff, I'm kind of a radicalist. Like if you're going to change something like a monster stat block, if the premise is, okay, it wasn't as, simple and functional and easy to read as we wanted it to be the first time around, I don't think they've gone far enough to change that. And this is it's a nitpicky opinion, right? Because it's similar to, I don't have the gravitas to say the name of this book, so James, if you could, when I point to you, say Flea Mortals, that would be great. It's a similar nitpick that I have to, I can't help but compare this to the recent MCDM funded project, which was, of course,
Flee, mortals!
Yes, there you go. It's a bestiary of its own, and it has its own organization of the stat block. Thank you, James. I needed the gravitas. But it's done a lot of cool little things to change it. I remember ages and ages ago, James Intricasso on Twitter saying, if there's one change you could make to the monster stat blocks in 5e, what would it be? And I said, please put the challenge rating at the top so I can see at a glance how difficult this monster is, so that I don't have to waste my time looking around for it. And they implemented that. But I still, like, there's the nitpicky part of me that's like, go further, go hard, change it all. Change it all. If you're going to simplify the spell lists, I want to, more of the exploding boom, right? I want you to give me, 3 spells in written out form so I don't have to go anywhere else and look them up. It's fine on a digital copy, but if you've got a physical copy of the book, you've got to go somewhere else and look up how the spell works. You can give me a full list of spells later on down the line and say, also, you can use these. But give me a couple of commonly used ones written out in full so that I don't have to do extra work.
Well, I'm curious how they've tackled it with the spellcaster specifically. All I've seen of the book is the table of contents, which is where all my criticisms and opinions come from, is seeing those 2 pages.
Good. Very informed.
But I've noted that obviously they've ported in all of the was it Volos, all the different wizard spell slots, that's not what the word I'm looking for, stat blocks, with the Conjurer and the Illusionist and the Evoker, etc., etc. Do those still have spell lists, or are even they paired back to actions that mimic spells?
Let me tell you this right now, since I have the page open. They have spell lists. They have spell lists. So they have a couple things that, like Shawn described, sort of written as though they are just a common ability, right? So they've got Arcane Burst, Force Blast, but they also have spell casting, which has a list of spells. But I just want more of those, right? Because they've got 2. I want enough to last me 4 rounds.
The common lifespan of a D&D monster.
Exactly.
In a way, I feel like the 4 of us are the exact wrong people to be talking about many of the updates to this book. We are all very creative people who, for the most part, are content to take what D&D has given us and kind of look at it, take what we like best, and then run with all the rest. Where I really feel like the core audience of Monsters of the Multiverse is players who have never DM'd a D&D game before. And they want to make their game more accessible to people who often look at the kind of tangled and arcane way that D&D books are written and not feel like they have to, complete a certificate course to be able to run the game.
Though, I mean, on that, the one sort of critique that I have heard from the book from someone who's actually read it, but then I went and looked at the list of chapters, what's it called? Table of contents. There we go. I got there in the end. My brain is mush today. Looked at the table of contents, and the way that it's laid out has been changed in an interesting way, where it looks like what they've gone for is full alphabetizing of all the monsters, rather than, putting all the dragons together, putting all the half orcs together or orcs together, etc., etc. Except that all the gnolls, their monster name is Gnoll, X thing, Gnoll Witherling, Gnoll whatever else, except for the Flind, which is a Gnoll creature, but it's put elsewhere because it doesn't have Gnoll as a prefix to the rest of its name. So the book seems a little bit confusingly laid out. All the giants used to be together, the Stone Giant, Dreamwalker, etc., and now they're scattered, across the entire book. I wouldn't have a huge problem with this myself. I mean, it's just a question of usability, except that they've put the NPCs, kind of scattered them through the entire book rather than having an NPC section at the end, which I know is a nitpick, but it's something I quite liked because it would be like, oh, I'm in a city, I'm in a town. Exactly.
Yeah, it seems a bit dodgy to me. I'm not sure about that one.
Dodgy, I like it.
Yeah, like I said, it's a nitpick, but it's also like, how do you? They have the monster or the beast kind of section at the back of the monster manual, but there's some monsters that would be there that are actually throughout the rest of the monster manual, so it can get a bit like, where do we put these? Do they go here? Do they go here?
Yeah, but I mean, I feel like there was some level of intuition in, this is the monster manual. Here's a lot of monsters, but if you go to the back, you can find animals like beasts that druids can turn into rangers can use as, animal companions. Some of them are familiar stat blocks, things that are closely tied to player classes, and then also the NPCs, right? Like that it made sense to me, but that is, I suppose, one of those things that's like, okay, yeah, but I'm now fluent in the language of tabletop RPG books. I know where to look for that stuff. Where would a new player look for it? Which is hard to kind of...
Yeah, fair. There was a comment on our last episode from Levi on YouTube. This is an Adventurers League kind of specific question, so maybe I'll throw it over to you, Shawn, whether you care about this or not, but basically saying that they felt a little bit burned because now everybody who enjoys playing Adventurers League has to move to the newest edition of all the latest version of all the monsters, the way that the player races work, et cetera, even if they, as the DM, sort of prefer using the previous versions with full spell lists, etc. Do you think that's a problem? Do you think, it just seems like a wargaming thing that happens every time an errata comes out for a war game, so move with the times?
Yeah. I've been through this so many times over so many editions that it's just, for me, it's, that this is welcome to, organized play. This is what organized play is.
Sure.
When you sign up for organized play, you do so with the understanding that you follow not just the rules of D&D, but the rules behind the rules. And one of those rules behind the rules is use the most up-to-date version of whatever you're doing, because everyone needs to play by the same rules as you go from table to table to keep the confusion down of, well, I'm playing a knoll and you're playing a knoll, but why is your knoll different than my knoll? Which knoll are you playing? And down that path lies not only madness, down that path lies losing players, new players who come in with this confusion of so much going on. So that's why organized play is the way it is. And there are good things about it, and there are some troublesome aspects for some people, and the troublesome aspects are just what we deal with to be a part of that overall community. So
yeah. Fair.
And I'm totally fine with people being upset about it, because you as a human being have a right to be upset about anything you want to be upset about. So rock on.
Table of contents layout.
Yes.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I'm not surprised by that answer. And I suppose it was just interesting for me as someone who hasn't been involved in the Adventurers League kind of sphere to know whether that is a usual thing that's happened across editions, which it has, which is unsurprising. Speaking of things that have to do with something and time.
Good segue.
Thank you.
This is your best one yet, Ben.
Stuck the landing there. Last week, I mentioned Cole Soak's question. They weren't actually asking about initiative. They were more so talking about giving things over to the players. And then I was like, that reminds me of alternative initiatives. And then realized after recording that we actually spoke about initiative in episode 21. You should check it out over there if you're listening on YouTube, or I'll put it in the show notes. We had Jim Davis on that episode. It was a lot of fun. So unless anybody's got anything to add to initiative, James, I don't think you were there on that episode. Do you have a preference for initiative that's not the way that it sort of works, rules as written?
Honestly, I find the typical D&D initiative works great for me. My players are not super cheesy tactical players. If they know the initiative and where all the monsters are, they will not kind of pick it apart. And so for me, and I think probably the majority of D&D players, that works just fine. And I imagine there are groups that aren't like that, and then an alternative system works great for them. But the vanilla system works great for me.
Yeah. I think... I'm not sure, because we talked about a bunch of different initiative alternatives last time. The one that I thought when reading this that I'm not sure whether we talked about is the really nitty gritty, if you're casting a spell, you roll with this dice. If you're just moving, you roll with this dice, and it scales up, and it's lowest initiative goes first, and it was all and you roll it every single round depending on the actions you're going to take, which a lot of people really like, and I'm sure that it's a simulationist's dream, but it is very complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that there's a discussion to be had there around like the simplicity of 5e simulating a story versus the complexity of a crunchier system 3.5. I played, was it RuneQuest or so, like another fantasy role-playing game a couple of years ago that used the where does it hit you dice, where you roll the d20 and it's like, does pardon me, hit you in the leg, hit you in the arm. Yeah, exactly. And it just felt like, even though that adds a level of grittiness or mechanical fidelity, it just felt like the GM had to keep coming up with excuses to, like, it hits you in the right arm again, like, you've got taken another wound there. Whether it's the flexibility of 5e allows you to kind of weave the story the way that you want to weave it. And I think that maybe trying to get into that, I think there was a whole Unearthed Arcana about Greyhawk Initiative, which used similar sort of concepts around, casting a spell takes longer. But it seems to just slow things down, I think.
I have tried many different ones, and it always comes back to based on player desire. But as soon as you have a system where an effect lasts until the start of your next turn or the end of your next turn, if you start messing around with play order, you get those effects where people are getting way too much power out of something or way too little power out of something. Because someone who takes damage at the start of their turn and they take 2 turns in a row, there's no chance for them to get that effect off of them beforehand. And the game itself does not lend itself to going outside of that cyclical initiative.
Game designer brain just kind of light bulbed up. Do you think that our effects that say until the end of your turn would be better suited for being until initiative count, 0, and until the start of your next turn being initiative count 20, and then opening up space for people to like delay their actions and move about in the initiative order and stuff like that?
Certainly interesting.
It's interesting. I'm not sure if it's good yet, is the thing. That's how these light bulb ideas
this is the spark phase of the roaring fire.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the question with that comes down to, do you want the players to game the game in that manner? So that, if I can go first next round, I will get away or I will be able to do something that alleviates a problem. Well, let's do everything that we can to get me to go first. Or get me to go last, because I have a death save coming. So if I can go last in this round, I give everybody the chance to heal me before I have to make that death save. It's fine if you want to play that way, but the game as it's written right now does not model that well. And it takes up time at the table that otherwise might be used for storytelling if you want to just tell the story at the table as opposed to play the game at the table.
Shawn, I really like the way you said that, just because so often when I'm editing manuscripts from like freelance writers, especially ones who, I can tell by reading what they've written that they started playing in like 3rd edition or something like that, is that I will often say, I'm editing this because what 5e likes to do is put its story element first and then assign a mechanical effect to the type of like story beat it's trying to do. Whereas you've got it the other way around. You've got the mechanical driving force first, and whatever story effect happens after that, it can ride. And I like gaming the game versus like storying the game as ways of talking about that.
Yeah. I think a similar point comes up because like in the previous conversation, I was a big proponent of Popcorn Initiative, which is where you choose the player that goes after you, whether it be a villain or whether it be a hero. You get to choose who takes their turn after you, which I love, and I would love to see it work for 5e D&D. But I don't think that it would, for similar reasons, because, players have these things that, last until the end of your next turn. And I think that there is such a mechanical incentive to game the game there, right? To have people say, oh, well, I need to go last because then we get the longest use of this spell that I've cast, which means that you end up with these kind of set patterns of how you behave in combat that does the exact opposite of what Popcorn Initiative is even trying to mechanically implement, which is this dynamic change of who goes next each round, completely goes out the window, because you know that if you let the wizard go first in round 1 and last in round 2, then you get 2 rounds worth of a spell, right? Like, you end up with these locked
2 rounds
patterns.
worth of stunning strike.
Well, we had
You said it so very well.
My brain just went in 7 different directions then, because we had somebody talk about alternative stun rules in an email, which I didn't pull for this week, so I can't remember off the top of my head. But also, Shawn, I was listening to the, I think it was the latest episode of Mastering Dungeons, where you and Teos talked about concentration. And I wonder, maybe it's making this conversation a little too complex, but dropping something around concentration into the way that, holding spells until the end of your next turn, start of your next turn, whatever it happens to be, could make that feel more dynamic, where it's like, you can continue to maintain concentration on this spell to make it last until the end of the initiative order, or else it ends on your turn. And so if you end up early in the initiative order, you can try to use a bonus action or something to push it to the end of the round instead of, and then that makes spell casting feel kind of more dynamic and like you're wielding the spell rather than just saying you did a thing and then it's happening until it's not.
Yeah, I mean, D&D is a very, 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 very complex machine, and we just have to understand as players and as homebrewers that you can think you're making a very minor tweak to the rules and it turns into a much, much larger issue than you had thought. Flanking, for me, is the perfect example of this. Flanking was made an optional rule, and everyone who played 4E or 3E just sort of grandfathered that in to the point where they treated it like it wasn't an optional rule. And so when they'd come to my table, I'd be like, no, flanking is an optional rule. We're not using that. And they would get so irate because they were not getting advantage. But then they noticed that, games were going much faster when everyone wasn't trying to get into the Congo line of death to get flanking. And, spell casting became a little bit easier for area of effect spells because everyone wasn't trying to be right next to. They could be anywhere near that enemy. They didn't have to. And, it's a huge thing to add it, even though you might not notice it while you're playing unless you take that time to really investigate it and play lots of different ways.
Butterfly flapping its wings. It's also worth mentioning that in 4th edition, flanking was because advantage didn't exist yet. It was like something like a +2 and not that many different things keyed off of flanking. Whereas a lot of things in 5e key off advantage, and advantage is much more powerful than a +2, so it's these little things.
This is a minor little bit of designer brain stuff, but usually when I think of an effect from an earlier edition that would grant a +2, and I try to move it into 5e, usually I think, let's have that add a d6 of damage instead. If I did the flanking rules, I'd say you deal an extra d6 of damage when you hit a creature you're flanking, because it's got about the same mechanical impact as a +2 damage or a +2 to hit. I mean, if I were to port Masterwork Weapons from 3rd edition, which had the +1 bonus to hit but no bonus to damage that magic weapons have, I would say a Masterwork Weapon deals an extra d6 of damage, and that's just how it goes.
Is that for simplicity's sake, so that you're doing less math?
I guess if I were really to get into it, I would have a Masterwork Weapon deal, a +1 point of damage rather than the +1 to hit. Just because in 5e, the way they've bounded their accuracy makes any boost to hitting monumentally more powerful in this edition than it was in previous ones.
Sure.
But on the opposite side, hit points have scaled much higher relative to armor class in 5th edition than in previous ones. So to get a similar effect, you just kind of swap what it gives.
Now you're thinking with portals.
The things you think about when you're designing D&D mechanics.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting because I've designed this knife is serrated, so it's like tears flesh. It does a +2 damage, but no bonus to attack rolls before, and kind of playing with it like that to just kind of try to get away from that +1 on everything, does magic, does damage to everything kind of mechanic that 5e typically falls back on.
This sort of thing is very much like translating from one language to another. You can do a literal translation and be correct, but you're probably missing a lot of the nuance that makes the text work in that language. You know, it's like translating poetry is translating D&D from one edition to another. You can't do a blanket literal translation or else it gets all googly.
Gotcha.
Gooply,
which is the technical term.
Yeah.
Technical game does a bit of feedback on some game design. It's a bit googly. Tighten the screws a bit.
Yeah.
Speaking of translating things, we got an email from a friend of the show, Gethin, who sent in a couple of emails now. He's wondering where their credit is as sort of invisible host of the show. They sent an email. The first quick question they had was asking about the Dark Souls tabletop RPG and the problems it faced. I haven't really looked at that deep into it. But what I found interesting about this part of the email was that Gethin thought, I think, that you and I, perhaps James, would have thoughts about Dark Souls as a tabletop RPG in general because of its dark fantasy kind of atmosphere. Maybe I've assumed you've played Dark Souls before. Have you played Dark Souls before?
I've played my first Souls game, Bloodborne, started about a month ago. I don't own consoles that Dark Souls is on, and my computer is not good enough to run them. But my friend has a PS5, and so I started playing Bloodborne, and I adore it. I love that game. And I bought a PS4 from a friend so that I could keep playing Bloodborne now that I'm not cat sitting for my friend. So yes, I do like my Dark Souls.
What do you enjoy about it?
My experience is a little narrow.
Sure. What do you enjoy about it?
I love dying over and over and over again and feeling myself kind of getting back to the boss and getting good.
Sure.
Like it's such a cliche to say it, but I really enjoy the getting good of Dark Souls. The methodically learning the way an enemy acts and kind of figuring it out piece by sort of arduous piece. The blood-starved beast in Bloodborne is the biggest example of this. I died to that guy. It must have been like 15, 20 times. And it's just because I didn't have the timing down, or I didn't have the pattern memorized correctly, or it's like it's got a big obvious tell when it raises its left hand and it just wasn't clicking for me or something like that. And not having read the Dark Souls board game, tabletop game in any way, shape, or form, I simply can't imagine how you would capture that feel in a tabletop game.
Have you played Dark Souls, Dael?
I haven't played Dark Souls. My first Souls game is Elden Ring.
Gotcha.
I've watched my brother play Dark Souls and have for many a year been like, perhaps I would enjoy this game. And his advice to me was, okay, they're coming out with a new one. I think you should start with it instead.
Gotcha.
I don't think he has faith in me and my ability to learn to defeat the bad guys, but that's fine. I don't need his support in life.
Sure.
But I do. I am fascinated in the way that those video games are designed in terms of the way combats happen, the way traps work. There's all these little like signposty things that I think is so useful to port into a tabletop RPG. I also haven't read the tabletop RPG, so I'm again useless, but I'm talking out of my butt. But I've done things. I've stolen ideas from the way that that Dark Souls does combat with big bosses to put in how I run dragons, right? Like I love this idea of a recognizable pattern that, if you don't follow the pattern, you can get absolutely just destroyed. But if you figure out the pattern, and because death is a little more permanent in D&D typically, a little, you have to be a little bit careful with how you implement it to make sure that you are translating it to a new sort of space. But I don't know. I assume in a Dark Souls tabletop RPG, you similarly come back and can collect your souls. I don't know if that's true.
Yeah, me neither.
The sort of philosophical difference that I think makes the translation from video game to tabletop game feel weird to me is that tabletop games are kind of like improv theater, right? I think this is a very mild take, because the tabletop games are a lot like improv theater, right? You yes and you keep moving. You move forward in tabletop games. playing a Souls game is kind of like learning to dance.
Ooh, you're not wrong.
There's a rhythm to follow, or like to dance or to play a piece of music. But I think to dance really because it's a very sort of dexterous game, where you learn how to follow a pattern, and you really are dancing, a violent digitized dance, but with another partner in each one of those boss fights. And you really practice it, and you learn until eventually you put on an incredible performance when you actually beat the guy. And I just feel like if I were doing that with 3 or 4 of my pals around a table, we'd just get kind of bored after a little while.
And it is interesting because the other thing is that what sets Dark Souls apart from other, Japanese angles on game design, where you do tend to see more of these, bosses with patterns, and this isn't even my final form, and all those sorts of things that you do expect from Dark Souls boss fight. The thing that sets Dark Souls apart from those is this cycle of death. Death is the thing. You are meant to practice. You are meant to practice over and over again until you get good, and then that's like the end goal, which you're right is very out of line with how a tabletop RPG typically works. So where some of those elements might port across easily, I don't think that necessarily does.
That said, Dark Souls, father of Dark Souls, Hidetaka Miyazaki, said that his inspiration for Dark Souls was getting his car trapped in a snowstorm on a mountain road, and then from out of the blizzard, a stranger appeared who was either traveling or similarly stuck. He knew nothing about this man, but the man sort of came up and said, "You're having trouble with this," and helped him push his car out of the snow, then disappeared into the blizzard, and they never saw each other again.
Okay, yeah.
And that is how multiplayer in Dark Souls works. You are one lone guy against insurmountable odds, and sometimes you summon another dude who helps you out, and then you vanish forever.
Or that dude runs up and kills you, Similarly, that dude runs up and shanks him. Yeah,
and a mysterious man appears like, you've been invaded by... Yeah, exactly.
And runs off into the snow.
I think there's a very cool tabletop dynamic where you've got, a more sort of directorial look at a scenario where, almost like the inverse of a normal gaming group where there's one GM and a bunch of players. There's kind of one player and like 4 GMs that are all kind of pulling and twisting different knobs and levers. That would be a very weird sort of interesting game. I'd love to see that happen.
And then how do you reconcile this difference between, just to go back to your performance metaphor, like a rehearsed piece where everyone knows their part and their place, and can all, take part in the performance versus, screw it, we'll do it on the night. Like...
But interestingly, I've read some of the critique of the Dark Souls game, even though I haven't read the text itself, which says very something about the internet, I think.
Sure, yeah.
But none of the critique I've seen has really centered around this RPG doesn't really capture the mechanics or the feel of Dark Souls. In fact, it's quite the opposite. I think a lot of people have really praised it for getting the feel of Dark Souls really right, which is interesting and makes me curious to read it. All the critique I've centered around seems to be it wasn't playtested very well, and there's a lot of vestigial garbage in the game design. Like, there's a stat referenced that's in the 5e SRD, but they've excised from the Dark Souls game, so this ability doesn't work at all because it references something that doesn't exist. I think it's interesting that we've had this very good, interesting game design-y conversation around how to make a Dark Souls game, when by all means, it seems like the Dark Souls game that exists is fine from a fundamental level. It's just, it needs another, 2 or month or 2 of polish, and then it would be great and wonderful, and this whole kerfuffle would never have happened. Or perhaps a different kerfuffle would have happened if the obvious low-hanging fruit weren't there.
The complaints that I saw about it, because again, haven't read it, but I saw the complaints. I saw people complaining about the 5e hack that was a Dark Souls hack and saying, why don't you just make a Dark Souls tabletop RPG? And everyone else was going, they have.
Is this what reignited the 5e thing on Twitter recently, where everybody's
it's just come around again.
Yeah, no, I know. Yeah, it's hit again. The there's other role playing games apart from 5e.
I'm so sick of that phrase.
I think we had this discussion on an earlier episode, yeah.
Someone I follow just put out an RPG Discourse bingo card because it does seem like every 1 to 3 months the exact same topics come back around. Yeah. And I want to play. That will make it bearable being on kind of RPG social media.
Yeah, I have to find that.
I used to have a girl on YouTube bingo card of annoying things people would say in my YouTube comments.
That's more depressing, I feel, than the other one.
Yeah, I don't know if I want to know what's on that bingo card.
It works. Brings the joy back. It gamifies it.
I'm glad it does.
Well, speaking of bingo cards, the other part of Gethin's question was the bingo card of fantasy lore, fantasy stories. He referenced how Mount Fuji often featured within artwork that was painted. I'm just quickly checking his email so I don't get this wrong. In Japanese artwork and photography. That Terry Pratchett talked about Tolkien's work on Lord of the Rings as being the Mount Fuji of the fantasy genre, because every story, every modern fantasy tale that came after Lord of the Rings kind of pays homage back to it in some way. And if it doesn't, even that feels like a deliberate choice to try to subvert Tolkien in some way.
Positional superiority.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm just, Gethin went on to kind of ask if Critical Role has become the Mount Fuji or the Lord of the Rings or the Tolkien of online role-playing actual plays. And I just thought I'd throw that into the arena. Have at thee.
This was a wild email to read because 8 years ago, Critical Role did not exist. And it's like as if Mount Fuji rose from the ground fully formed 8 years ago, and we watched the sort of geological event happen instead of our civilization kind of growing around this. And I imagine it would very much be like that if Mount Fuji suddenly appeared over the course of about 3 years, rising from the ground near Tokyo.
This is only tangentially related, so I apologize. But I was talking about how weather patterns are used in storytelling to like direct the mood of a narrative, right? I promise this will loop back around. One of the things I was talking about was blizzards and how blizzards are like, they end up being used for revelation, right? Like someone's lost in a blizzard and then a figure appears out of the snow.
And then you get Dark Souls. To guide them. Yeah.
I'm just saying, and then Dark Souls happens. But one of the examples was, my mum was like, Kimber the White Lion, which was an anime from when she was a kid. Which, I mean, The Lion King is basically Kimber the White Lion. I know we all say it's Hamlet, but it's really Kimber the White Lion. But there's this thing that happens in Kimber the White Lion where from time to time, the African savannah is in desperate need of aid. And quite literally, Mount Fuji appears out of nowhere and it begins to snow in the African savannah. And the king, in this case, Kimber the White Lion, who is, he is a child, but let's just go with it. He has to venture into the blizzard on Mount Fuji to go and visit a mystical mammoth who is still on the mountain from ancient times, who will share wisdom.
Yeah, just like the Lion King.
Yeah, I don't remember that, the Lion King.
So if we're talking about Mount Fuji arriving out of nowhere within this artistic space to like take part in the narrative, there's quite a literal example.
Okay, cool. Shawn, what do you think about the Tolkien-esque, the Tolkienification of the fantasy genre?
Yeah. Well, Tolkien is there, right? Every fantasy story that came afterward was pretty much influenced by it. I don't think we can, underestimate its importance. And I think the same thing with Critical Role in the sense that we can't underestimate the impact that it had on a new generation of D&D players. So important, so valuable to growing the game. But there are so many different players out there. There are so many different play styles out there. So many different likes and dislikes. We can call Critical Role the Mount Fuji of D&D, but then we have to remember that there's also a Kilimanjaro and an Everest and the Alps and Mount Rainier, and there's also the Andes. For D&D gamers. So we can call it Kilimanjaro, but it is a peak among many in this hobby of ours.
Actually, interestingly, Tolkien himself talked about he called it a soup, right? You chuck stuff into the soup, and you can never remove something from the soup once you've added it. So like, I don't know, this isn't the example he used, but let's talk about vampires, right? So
Yay!
you've got your mythical concepts of, beings who live on consuming the blood, right? And then you end up with Bram Stoker's Dracula. You end up with Nosferatu. You end up with Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Interview with a Vampire. You end up with Twilight, and all those things get added into the soup, and it changes how we think about vampires culturally. Every little thing ends up adding together, and you can never take it out, right? So the base ingredient might be, Lord of the Rings or Critical Role, but all these other things are being added into what is fantasy, what is a tabletop RPG or an actual play. And over time, it all just adds to the flavor of the thing.
I like where you ended up there. That brought it back around. Well, speaking of brewing things, James's email asks about homebrew settings being worth publishing, asking that they've been working on their own campaign setting for a while that they think is fairly lush and filled with interesting things, but wants to know at what point is it worthwhile trying to turn your own D&D 5e campaign setting into a supplement? What makes it worth, in their emails
Shawn.
terms,
What makes it
turning it into a
worth
supplement?
publishing your own setting?
I really want to know. I really need the answer to this. I emailed the show just so I could find out if it's worth publishing my home free setting.
Is this your way to pitch to the company, James? You you can just do that. You don't have to guise it up or anything.
You are the lead designer, James. The lead designer.
That's true. Yeah, you just say we'll do it. Like, it's fine.
Yeah.
Shawn, you answer this, James, who is not me.
Okay, James, who is not our James.
Sure.
Does it need to be unique and interesting enough? No. And yes. And maybe. We are living in a time when we have the license to make not only our own role-playing games, but our own D&D settings. So we absolutely have the right, and if we are creative enough, the responsibility to put our work out there into the world and see what happens. Customers and consumers and fans also have the right to either embrace it or ignore it. And if you hit the right chord with the right people, you will be just fine and you will have an audience. There are just amazing ideas and amazing settings out there that are published and don't get the attention they deserve. And there is some absolute garbage out there that gets much, much more attention and praise that it deserves, because that is the sort of world we live in. And so what's the saying? You never miss the shots that you don't take. So if you are passionate enough and you are a creator and you want to do that, then by all means do it. And when you succeed, great. When you fail, even better, because then you've learned a lesson that you can use for the next time you create something. So absolutely self-publish.
I just want to jump in. Sorry, Shawn. You're paraphrasing "you miss 100% of the shots you don't take" into "you miss none of the shots you don't take." Because it's just very, very funny to me.
This is true. This is true as well.
Are they both true technically?
It's kind of a double-edged sword that for us.
Schrodinger's untaken shots.
Anyway, self-publish, yes.
Yeah. What Shawn says, right? Fail early, fail often is like the go-to phrase for you need to do a thing before you can reiterate it and make it better, right? Fail early, fail often. You want that. If you want to think about it technically, sure. Like your homebrew setting might, you want to think about is this filling a niche? Is there a gap that this can provide filling for, that people will be interested in. But the thing is, in an age of digital retailing, the long tail effect means that no matter how small an audience for a product is, there is an audience for it and they can find it. So it's never not worth, just to add more confusing phrases into the mix, it's never not worth not publishing it if that's what you want to do. If you're willing to put in the work and the effort and the time to put your thing out there for people to buy. I mean, why not do it?
Yeah, I think it depends on your goals a little bit, like whether you want to publish the next big, thing that's going to take over tabletop RPG, or whether you just want to like share your creativity with other people. I think
which isn't a one-step process, right? So
no.
You got to start somewhere. I would recommend starting somewhere that doesn't require material costs.
Yes, and that is the important thing that several people miss, is you create something and do it in a nice Word document and put it up on DriveThruRPG, say, you are buried behind all of the great art, cover art, interior art. That stuff costs money. Doing a nice layout, whether you do it yourself, which is time consuming, or pay someone to do it, which is costs you money. All of that stuff goes into quote unquote success. So if you want thousands of downloads, don't expect to just put up a PDF of a Word document and have it succeed. It definitely can, but you are always doing more than you expect to have to do to get your thing in front of as many eyes as it deserves.
100%. Life hack for those people as well. Learn to get good at finding public domain art from, like, I want to say the late 1800s. Any artist who died before 1950, that art is in the public domain. You can find a lot of art that can double as fantasy art, and it'll close some of that visual gap between your product and products of people who can afford to pay artists.
Yeah. And also, public domain laws differ internationally. Make sure the public domain laws are correct within your jurisdiction.
Yeah. What Jim said. This is not legal advice. Asterisk.
This podcast is in no way qualified for legal advice.
And now that we've gotten into legal advice, everyone is like, I need to run far away from ever publishing anything, which is also not a bad
Which is
call.
also, It should be worth saying, drifting kind of back away from legal advice into, publishing stuff, is that, like we've touched upon a little bit, really temper your expectations. And like Shawn said, start small, iterative, publish like 3 spells on your Twitter page or something. Get people to start interacting with your stuff. Like, there are people on Twitter who I follow who like publish a monster stat block every day or every week or something, and I follow them because they make something cool. And eventually, as more people see their cool stuff, they'll move from doing free work that they do for fun into publishing something because they put their own time and effort and money even into it, and they want to recoup the cost of doing it. There is a lot of unpaid, only for the pleasure of it work that I think in an industry like this kind of has to happen, unless you're a very, 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 very lucky person who manages to find, the fractional percentage of jobs that exist in this industry.
Does suck though, doesn't it?
Right. It does kind of suck. The freelancer hustle is a great dance move and also very, very tiring, and you will do it for years.
I want to see the freelancer hustle. But it's just a bunch of exhausted looking people like zombies around the dance floor, I'm sure.
And if you're just a guy with your computer and a dream, do not try and make a D&D killer. It will break your heart. Because like the only D&D killer that has ever done it is Pathfinder. And 1, only for a while. And 2, look at the history of Paizo leading up to Pathfinder, right? They had so many amazing people working on Dragon Magazine, licensed from Wizards to Paizo Publishing for years before they got it in their heads to make their D&D killer when the least popular edition of D&D came out and an open license for the most popular up to that point edition of D&D had come out, right? The stars had aligned for them. And they did it. So temper your expectations, start small, make something that really sings to you. Don't try and second guess what anyone else wants. Do what you want. And if you gain popularity or money or whatever from it, bully for you. But keep your expectations small and have fun.
MT Black gave a keynote speech at the Australian Role-Playing Industry Awards recently, where he said that marketing is kind of where the real work is if you are on your own as a tabletop RPG designer and or 5e licenser, campaign setting writer, where you do the work, you make the thing, you put it up on DriveThruRPG or whatever avenue you find to distribute it. But marketing it, getting it in front of people is kind of where the job actually really begins, and that's where the work really is. But yeah, I think, as I said, I agree with you, James, that you need to find a love for it and kind of temper your expectations and or define success for yourself, which I think I might be speaking off the top of my head a little bit here. Teos is doing a series of videos about guides for freelancers, Teos Abadea. And the latest one, I haven't watched it yet, but said, setting success, defining success for yourself.
You should make goals things that you have control over, right? Like, I'm going to write this many words in this much time. The final product will contain this much information about this, blah, 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 whatever. Make them things that you can control. Don't set your goals as like, I will sell this many copies, because you can't control that.
Yeah, sure. Speaking of selling things.
That's when you have a marketing team. When you're a company with a marketing team, then you can aim for, units moved. Never before then.
Speaking of moving units, it's time to move this unit off the internet for another week. That was a weird turn of phrase.
Move that unit!
Yeah, let's get that unit moving. If you want to send an email, you can email podcast@ghostfiregaming.com, and I will choose them and I will read them out and we will pull them apart and talk about them, just like James did. I can see you, James. And James like, what did I do? Non-James, hey, actual James. Anyway, I'm waffling now.
The actual James.
Otherwise, you can leave a comment if you're listening to this on YouTube. We do read through those as well and sometimes pull those up. Otherwise, go out, tell your friends about the Eldritch Lorecast, and we will be back next week. I've been Ben Byrne here, as always, with Dael Kingsmill, James Hake, Shawn Merwin, and until next week, we will see you then.